All right, we're live now. Welcome to the channel. Today, we're going to do a little review of some of the comments we had regarding. I put out, I think, like 5 or 6 videos last week. Just they're all Bonson clips, just kind of starting some discussions up. And so today, I want to go over. There was a lot of interesting comments regarding the critiques of Bonson's arguments and transcendental arguments and things like that, materialism, atheism, empiricism. So I want to just go through them all here because at some point when you reach like 400 comments, it's just like it's very tough to sometimes get your point across correctly. We had some intelligent comments and we had some, I would say, less intelligent comments this week, but nonetheless, we're going to review some of the conversations. Some people, yeah, like I said, they did have like intelligent critiques or things to say. And it gets spicy sometimes in comment section, and that's fine. There's a little bit of spicy back and forth. But if people come on, which I had some people, I invited some people to come on and discuss slash debate. Um, you know, definitely, we can back that off a little bit there. But in comment sections, it is what it is. But we had a video called "Atheism is an Illogical Worldview" by Bonson, and we had someone comment here, and they would ask me that I would show the entire thread. So I'm going to show you the entire thread and kind of give a viewpoint on what I think maybe the fundamental misunderstandings that are going on with transcendental arguments, worldview claims, making any sort of isot claims, which seem to be a big one that we ran into with this week's videos, and also just understanding what the transcendental argument is getting at, what we mean by, sort of understanding what worldviews are and how thoughts are placed in worldviews and things like that, propositions. So, first off, we had someone comment, they said, because basically Bonson's making the claim that, hey, atheism is an illogical worldview. It's internally not coherent. And so this individual said, the foundation of the claim made by the video shows a fundamental a misunderstanding of what atheism actually is. Atheism is the answer to one specific question. If you believe the claim that a god or gods exist, if the answer is yes, theist, no, you're an atheist. So you're saying atheism is part of worldview, but not the worldview in and of itself. Has nothing to say about what a person should believe regarding the beginning of our universe or life, mortality, the supernatural. Do I find meaning and purpose in my life? And so here's what I would say a common thing that happens in when we get into atheist, materialist, empiricist debates. One of the things that happens is they like to say, well, atheism is not really a worldview. It's just one claim that I have. And the problem with that is if you even if you just make one claim that there isn't a God, that's going to encompass a whole bunch of other presuppositions and assumptions you're making about the state of the universe, truth, propositions themselves. So you can't just avoid the question by saying, well, I'm just making a statement about one specific thing when that encompasses a whole bunch of other things. So I believe in a coherentist view of truth. So I'm not a foundationalist where we kind of have one starting axiom, we can build everything on top of that. If you read the Christian Contours book series, if you read the one on epistemology, it goes into the coherentist view of truth, where facts or your views or things you have in your worldview actually sit with other views in your worldview, other statements, other propositions, and how they have to cohere. So when I responded, I said atheism is a worldview because there are a number of presuppositions and assumptions made when denying the existence of God. And maybe you could turn that claim into, well, I'm agnostic. I believe we don't know, or something like that. That still is going to encompass a whole host of assumptions. And so I said statements about the existence of God is couched in a greater web of beliefs because that's going to determine what you think is possible. If you don't believe there's a God, then that is you also don't believe that a God is possible in this universe. And that's also going to come with a number of other assumptions that if you don't believe in any sort of deity about metaphysics, epistemology, about how we understand truth, that's all going to come around with that. So you can't avoid it. You can't find a way out of the conundrum. So I'm saying, for example, language, logic, and metaphysics are posited in the simple statement of denying the existence of God. So you could say, well, there is no God, but you are utilizing language. So you do believe language has meaning. You do believe that language is able to convey things. You do believe concepts exist and material things exist. And so you're making a whole host of assumptions, even in that statement. And that's what it kind of comes down to when we critique things like the cogito from Descartes. I think, therefore I am. Like that's the most base level of thought when it's like, well, you're presupposing, time commitments. You're presupposing that, there is something referring to time, that there is a self in and of itself. And so you're not going to be able to escape the conundrum. And so he has a reply, okay, something about Christmas. He says, atheism does not require any of the beliefs you stated. Well, yes, it does, because, like I said, our beliefs fit in another web of beliefs. And so because you assume there is no God, you're going to make other assumptions about other parts of your worldview. And so as a human being, I've been born on this planet. I've been trying to learn more about it. And so even when you have statements like, I've been born on this planet, can you empirically verify that you were born? I mean, you may say that, oh, consciously I was there, but do you have a memory of you being born? How do you know that's accurate? I think that would be an interesting critique. I've been trying to learn more about it and the universe my entire life. There are people making the claim that one or more gods exist. I'm not convinced their claim is true. So now we're going to fall into the psychological status argument, which is, I think, one of the other common arguments where it's, well, I'm just simply not convinced by the claims. That has nothing to do with the facts of whether a God exists, whether it's true or false, but pertains to your psychological status. That's not an argument. So saying you're not convinced, not at all an argument. So far, all the responses I've been given largely fall in the categories of logically fallacious arguments. He doesn't really demonstrate that. Personal experiences that I have no way to investigate. Okay, so right there, he's making assumptions that we're going to solve all the questions. So we're going to solve the questions of God's existence just based on personal experience that he has no way to investigate. So he's already making an assumption that this is how we investigate truth claims like this. So that's what I'm saying. We say that atheism is true or God doesn't exist. You do have to presuppose other things in that statement because you're already presupposing a criteria for truth, a burden for truth, or a criteria for you being convinced before you even make that statement. And misunderstanding what atheism is. Until theism and theists are able to meet their burden of proof, well, that's just going to depend on what you believe proof is. But I believe that it has been presented. I remain unconvinced. That's just a psychological, claim. Okay, and then he talks about language a little bit. He says, I'll give credit for some apologists to single out language. I'd be curious to see how you think I'm presupposing language. Well, by stating words and sentences, you're presupposing that language can convey meaning. That's what I'm saying by you're presupposing language, which hasn't been demonstrated in your empirical worldview yet. Language is something that I can demonstrate at any time, including right now. Right, you can demonstrate it, but not in a justifiable way. I have thoughts in my head and I'm typing letters into an understood format so that once you read them, you know correctly understand what thoughts I'm having. I mean, that's assuming a whole host of things. That's assuming that the definitions of words or the sounds you make with words or what you're typing, that I have the same exact concept you do, especially in an empiricist worldview where all these things eventually have to map up to matter, right? They have to be equal to matter. So words have to be equal to matter. And if our experiences are different regarding matter, how do you know that the information, which is immaterial, I believe is immaterial, actually is able to map to something that is the same in my experience. You don't really know that. And so that's not really not something you're able to demonstrate in an empiricist worldview. So that is by definition what language is. You utilize language with every single person in your life. So now this actually kind of crosses over into what I'm saying with transcendental arguments, where we do utilize language, right? We can't actually demonstrate what language is without using language. It is a circular category. So there is a level of circularity there, but it is a paradigmatic circularity. And the only way it can be demonstrated is by the impossibility of the contrary, that the other worldviews are false. So because we use language and because it's demonstrated that we're using language, then I'm saying via transcendental argument that, yeah, that language does exist, but it's not something I could demonstrate with some other category of propositions. So no assumption or presuppositions are about language are needed. Well, they are because you're assuming that the meaning is being conveyed about language. And so I stated that you saying that you're not convinced of claims of God's existence is an argument justification, but reporting of a psychological status, right? So I think I kind of boiled down the argument to saying that atheism can't give a justification for the things that make knowledge possible. You're just assuming words have meaning and you have self-having thoughts. Using language isn't an epistemic justification for language itself, right? So just saying you're using something doesn't mean that you have a justification for it. So just saying, well, I've used languages and it works. So well, why should language work, right? Why should there be regularity in how language works? I mean, how do you know that in an empiricist worldview? And also the problem with the self. So, right, we have the problem with the self in an atheist worldview because you can't empirically verify where in sense data is an idea of the self. I think that I would like to hear a justification for that one. As an atheist, by definition, I'm not convinced the claim that one or more gods exists is true. Right, here we go. So now he goes into, well, it's like a courtroom situation where you present evidence and then the jury is convinced of being true or false. And when it comes to normative day-to-day logic or empirical events and things like that, for example, and I explain it here, so you can read his whole uh, you know, thing he wrote up here. He asked that I show the entire thing, so I'm showing the entire thing right there, and people can read it in the comments section as well. But I said, you're assuming everything is proven in a courtroom empiricist schema, so he's acting as if all things are proven in the same way. I'm making a stronger claim that the preconditions of knowledge must be justified and established before making a sort of empirical claim. So all of our empirical claims, empirical understandings, it really only makes sense in a world where these categories of logic, self, words having meaning, language, actually are justified and make sense and are actually invariant and immaterial and constant and are eventually grounded in God, the mind of God, and justified there. And so I said, because God is a spiritual being, he's not going to be proven in the same way that as the questions, are there crackers in the pantry, which is what Bonson often says, where we can simply look at the evidence and determine if it is so. I mean, where do we look to go, okay, is logic the case? Where do we look, right? You can say, well, there's identity in the world, there's identity in, out there in the world somewhere, so that proves logic. And maybe you can make that proposition, but the proposition of logic itself, because you saying A equals A is going to be an inference that is beyond just the sense data itself. So I'm saying preconditions of knowledge, in my opinion, and God itself, they have to be more certain and prove to be more justifiable in a transcendental fashion. And then we show that the worldview is coherent and the only possible worldview by our analysis and the possibility of the contrary. So I'm saying you stating that concepts can be transferred from one person to another is a metaphysical claim, right? So this is the point I made with words, right? Is that you're just assuming that words and concepts are the same in our heads. You don't know that in an empiricist schema. Why? Because we've had different experiences. How do you know that we have ideas of the same concepts, right? We're interpreting things differently. And so that leads to the question, well, there must be something immaterial and invariant that must be the commonality between us, but you can't really go there if you're an empiricist. So I said, you saying concepts can be transferred from one person to another's metaphysical claim. How do you know abstract and material things like concepts exist, right? This is a good question. And so he asked me how I escape the solipsis problem because I was questioning his sense data. So he says, how do I know that I'm a self? Now you're bringing up the problem of hard solipsism, which I argue maybe they're a little bit different questions than that. But how are you in the same boat as I am and every other person that none of us can prove that we're not brains in a vat or people that are plugged into the matrix simulation? Not true, but there's an easy response to solipsism. If the world is solipsis, or if my brain is just, in a vat, or I'm in some sort of matrix or something, then me coming to the truth of me being in the matrix, me being my brain in a vat, is also a part of the simulation. So it is self-refuting in of itself. And so the only way we can prove the external world, in my opinion, is not through more empirical sense data, which is the thing in question, but in a transcendental fashion. Because we are debating here, we are assuming an external world, and because all the possible worldviews, for example, the matrix worldview, eventually leads down the road of being incoherent, there must be an external world. That's the justification for it. But I'm not justifying it through sense data, but instead through transcendental arguments. But I don't think the materialist really wants to go there with that. So this way I can escape the solipsis problem. The atheist cannot. The self and external world, logic, and reason are all needed to make knowledge possible at all, and these are grounded in God, but cannot be empirically verified. So this is my entire point. So you stating that atheism is not making any claims about truth is a nonsensical answer. So I think let's go back here. The fact that you point out atheism is not an argument or justification yet again shows that you have a fundamental misunderstanding. Atheism is not justifying anything because it's not trying to make any justifications. So we're trying to retreat into, well, it's not really trying to make any statements. It's not really trying to propose any truth. And it's like, so you're going to say something is the case, but also not the case? That doesn't make any sense. Atheism only tells you what my current belief is regarding the claim that one or more gods exist. Again, that's a psychological reporting, not an argument. So if you're actually going to argue, we're assuming that what you think you believe is true. But if you don't actually believe that or you think it's subjective, then why are you even debating in the first place if you don't think truth propositions regarding your worldview make sense or even possible? My biggest hope is that you finally notice I'm for the third time pointing out your responses show your fundamental misunderstanding. No, I'm not. I don't have a misunderstanding. I think he's trying to avoid the problem of atheism being a worldview, making claims about how the world is, and he keeps trying to escape that. Now, in earlier comments, did I bring up empiricism? I said that I listened to whatever reasons or evidence a theist has for their position. Yeah, so he's just restating his position that he's psychologically not convinced. I'm saying that's not really an argument. And he doesn't really understand my argument regarding how everything is not proven in the same way. When you say God is a spiritual being, how would a person be able to falsify a claim that it's possible for a spiritual being can exist? If you cannot answer that question, you have the problem of believing an unfalsifiable proposition. Well, when it comes to metaphysical beings, like for example, I was arguing against other religions again, and now move into the domain of metaphysics, and then we could discuss, the repercussions of that. But from an empiricist or atheist, not really going to delve too much into the metaphysics category. I started to respond to your questions about concepts, and before I knew it, okay, Nesse, I'm making a claim that mental concepts exist. Right. So I'm asking, how do you justify, how do mental concepts exist on his worldview? That's what I want to know. Fortunately, now I owe myself $20. I bet myself that your answer would include something that cannot overcome hard solipsism. Well, it does overcome hard solipsism. Prove that I'm a prophet. Okay, weird. Weirdly enough, that he said near the very end that end of weakening your position in a circular way. The entire point objection I made to your video is that you have fundamental. Okay, here we go. But so, I mean, the objection that, oh, your view is circular, and it's like, well, everyone has presuppositions, and everyone eventually has some sort of final authority in their worldview. So you're not going to be able to have this foundationalist claim that you're able to avoid circularity at some level. So that would be my analysis of that conversation there. Overall, interesting. I think you brought up some interesting points. Now, we had a number of conversations. This video got a lot of comments, which was pretty crazy. So there's a lot of interesting arguments here. I'll go through a few of them. There was a lot of there's a lot of debate points to go through. So let's I guess we could just start at the top here, because this one's a pretty good one actually. So this one is atheists have to assume God exists, or God is the precondition for knowledge, and you have to borrow from the Christian worldview to even make sense of the real world. So this person says here, the moral argument, that old chestnut tree. Interesting. Even if he was right, generally, there's a difference between arguing as if you have an absolute standard and actually having one, which is why the title is not correct. So he says he wrote a response to the moral argument. So the short version is this. Now we're getting to the domain of ethics. So let's see what he has to say about this. There's no good reason to think that there's such a thing as absolute morality. And I'm not aware of any way you can have objective morality that isn't ultimately based on some subjective value. So what's really funny here is that we already have some self-refuting notions here, where it's like, okay, so we can't know anything about morality as subjective, except for the absolute claim that there's no good reason to think that there is such a thing about absolute morality. And I'm not aware of any way you can have objective morality. So we're already making a universal claim about something you're claiming to be entirely subjective. My moral system is based on the well-being of people. So here we go with sort of the Sam Harris, and I'm going to be doing a talk, actually multiple talks on Sam Harris's book, The Moral Landscape. We're going to be going through the entire thing, and I have another lecture prepared on the discussion of ethics from a Christian worldview. And then we're going to actually go through basically the entire book and break that down. So my moral system is based on the well-being of people. So I'm interested to hear how he gives a justification for this system. If something can be demonstrated to objectively increase people's well-being, then I call it good or moral. And so do most other people too. So we're going to make an appeal to consensus for morality. By the way, theists included. Just because you share beliefs with theists doesn't give a justification for your view. That's what morality commonly means. You might say that good isn't in accordance with God's nature, but there's at least two big problems with this. After you set aside the problem of how you know anything at all about God's nature or whether one even exists, well, because it's revealed through divine revelation. One, this is also still subjective morality. You just have to put the subjectivity onto God. You can say that there are objective and absolutely follow every command God gives you. Congratulations. And now God is the subjective viewpoint. No. So morality or God's law is an extension of his nature, which in our system, of course, God is objectively true. And we do the best to follow God's law because it's a reflection of the truth of the nature. You may believe that he knows best, but you actually aren't qualified to judge, are you? So he's going to be, oh, because you're fallible, that we can't know truth. And so we believe God has set up a universe where, yes, we are fallen creatures, but we can still access truth through his divine revelation. And so it doesn't mean we aren't able to follow his law. You remove yourself from moral decision making entirely. If God says that working on Sunday is wrong, then you aren't going to do it. Okay, so I don't understand what this has to do with the main argument, but anyway, you may ask, what standard are you using to judge God? Who says you have to value well-being? Me, literally, I say so. So, right, that'd be the definition of being arbitrary, right? It actually doesn't go farther than that. So, don't ask me questions that go farther than that. I decided that I care about well-being. If you agree with me, then we can build a moral system we can agree upon. So just give me my first principles that we should care about well-being, and then we can build our entire system on top of it. So just grant me that, and then all of a sudden I can prove to you morality based on objective facts that we both know to be true. What if I don't value well-being? Why is this absolute? What makes me care about other people and even myself? So he hasn't really given much of an account for well-being, other than we agree it's good for people, which that kind of just begs the question of what well-being is. Nothing absolute. Your brain is most likely hardwired with some amount of self-preservation and aversion to pain and suffering, and some amount of empathy for at least some people. That's just the biologics, right? So this is just all social constructs. It's all arbitrary. There's nothing objective about morality. He already admitted that. The universe doesn't care about humans, but I do. I care, and that's that. Okay, again, it doesn't matter that you care. I'm asking for a justification why we should care. You can say that I only care because God programmed me to care, so that's not what we believe either. We do have free will as people. Though I don't know how you supposedly square that with free will. Right, so, I mean, acting like there aren't any responses to the quote unquote problem of free will, but because we believe God can create a universe where there are secondary causes, so he providentially has created a universe with people with free will who can act as secondary causes in accordance with what he has decreed from the beginning of time. But in any case, you would still need to prove that God exists. What else you got? So let's see. Let's see where my first response is. I don't know why it doesn't show my first response. Okay, then he writes even more about what he thinks Christianity is. Okay, so he's responding to what Bonson had to say. So here's my very short response, right? This is a very, I think, devastating critique to his position. I said, if there's no reason to believe in your system of well-being, which you need to give an account for, there's no reason for us to follow your system at all. I said, you can't take states of what you think is objective is and turn them into things we ought to do. On an empiricist worldview, materialist, atheist, doesn't matter. All actions really are equal. There's no value to any of the actions. It doesn't really matter what we do. I could go out, and I'm not saying this is my view. People don't understand what internal critique is and the difference between the Christian view. But on this worldview, on this materialist worldview, I could go out and kill people, take all their money. It doesn't matter at the end of the day, right? There's no judgment for it. There's no right and wrong. We can kind of maybe in a social way agree that, okay, it might be quote unquote good for us to not do those things, but why does it matter? Why shouldn't you make yourself God, emperor of the world? So I said, then you can't turn your oughts into is right. So, right, Hume on is and ought. Atheists like to avoid this question whenever possible because states of matter and things happening in the world doesn't give you any conclusions about what should be. So then he says here, it's not really a system of claims in which to be believed or disbelieved. Starting with some water. Reading a lot here today. It's not really a system of claims in which to be believed or disbelieved. You're essentially correct about the rest. That is the gist of what I'm saying. If you don't value health and well-being of your fellow man, I don't believe there's anything I could ever say to convince you that you should unless I'm able to tie it to some other value that you hold. But if you do agree that we should care about well-being for any reason, right? So, well, we should care about it for any reason if you just grant me that we should care about it. And I'm asking, why should we care about well-being? Okay, and then he just some rhetoric here. If there isn't anything that someone values, I mean, there's no intrinsic reason anyone must value anything. So there's no reason we have to value anything. So you're admitting that all actions are equal, that it doesn't really actually matter. Then there would be no point trying to discuss it with them. You'd be hard pressed to find someone who truly didn't value anything at all. Yeah, it doesn't matter if I can't find anyone who doesn't value anything at all. What I'm asking is, why should we value something? and you admit that there's no intrinsic reason we should value anything. So it says if your claims are not truth claims and we shouldn't value them as truth claims, then they're not really arguments and you're forfeiting the debate because there's no real logical force behind your claims. There's no reason I should believe what you believe. You're just saying it's arbitrary, it's my opinion. And he goes, okay, yeah, that's the end of the discussion. If you're saying what I'm saying is arbitrary, there's no reason to believe it, there's no value to it, you've exited the debate at that point. So there's no reason for us to believe what you believe. You're not really debating. Craziness. Let's see. Let's pick one of the. This one might be a long thread. Okay, we'll pick this as the last thread of the Atheist Chronicles for today. So here, so someone wrote some responses to what Bonson say. This was regarding, evil and morality. If there were no standards of good and evil in this world, you couldn't call anything evil, which I would agree with. Up, down, here, there, red, blue, hungry, full, happy, sad, all seem to work pretty well without absolute transcendental standards. Again, just because you perceive something to quote unquote work, it doesn't mean that's a justification for why that thing is. They're just psychological descriptors you have for them, but there's no intrinsic value. There's no uh, reason we should know that those things actually are happy, sad. And then he also makes some category errors between good and evil being objective, moral, transcendental categories, and psychological statuses of being hungry and full, right? They're not the same. How could you call an action wicked? That's the word we use for actions that stresses our limbic system in a certain way, right? So he's just saying everything is just a descriptor. So because it stresses our body, we just kind of call that wicked. But if everyone agreed that that wasn't wicked and actually stresses our limbic system, and we called that, good, that would mean the same thing. And so at that point, the meaning of words mapping to the real world would be completely gone. It's just everybody's individual desire and feeling. No, the biology of our limbic system makes us react more right, more or less the same way, regardless individual desire and feeling. So just because we act a certain way doesn't tell us that it ought to be the case. Just because humans will react in a certain way under certain events, we don't know if that's the correct way to act. Maybe everything should just completely devolve. Maybe humans should act, completely dysfunctional. You don't know that we should function at all. Suppressing God, there's no need to suppress something for this. There's no reliable evidence, right? So not going to give an account of what evidence is or how different things are proven in different ways. Just going to assert that. So I said, with regards to morality, you're just describing states of being. This doesn't tell us anything about what we ought to do, right? This is my critique. Maybe stresses on our limbic system is good. He doesn't know. Well, maybe stresses on our limbic system will create some sort of new strand of evolution for the human race. I mean, how does he not know that that could happen? How do you know one is good and the other is bad without arbitrarily labeling it? Well, we need a word to describe the feeling, and evil is a valid word to describe that system stressing out. Evil is a valid word. Why? Why not pick a good? I mean, why is that not good? Maybe I like feeling stressed in my limbic system. This said on one basis is valid. That's just an arbitrary designation, not a justification. Additionally, you stating we need something is a moral claim in the domain of ought. So now we're moving to ought, which we're going to have to justify. It's easier to communicate and avoid it if there's a word that describes that feeling. Okay, so not a justification, just saying I want to describe things. Why should we describe things? Why should we communicate things? I mean, I think this is an important point to make. This is internal critique, people. I'm not saying this is my view. This is internal critique. It's no different from having words for John, hungry, here, minute, or red. So yeah, if all words are just descriptors, then they don't actually have meaning that maps up to anything. They're all ultimately arbitrary designations that makes communication easy. So all words are arbitrary. They're not transcendental categories. They're not immaterial. They don't actually map out to real things. They're just all ultimately arbitrary designations. So I said if all words designations are arbitrary, then meaning is arbitrary. And your arguments are arbitrary, right? This is where this position leads. And I'm saying this is not my position because at this point people were not understanding what internal critiques were, but the conclusion of your worldview. Words have meaning in my view because words have objective, extrinsic, metaphysical meaning and existence. And so not really understanding the critique. What we decide to communicate about is arbitrary. The words, so everything is arbitrary. So he's trying to prove a point that his argument is somehow correct, that he, his state, I'm assuming he's saying that, you know, these things are true. But now only 5 comments down, he's saying everything is arbitrary. The words we use is arbitrary, but as long as we stick to the law of identity, it doesn't matter that word itself and what the word represents is arbitrary. You and I can label anything we like to communicate about anything we want. So implying that so now the law of identity has come into play. So now we're gonna have to get a justification for where's the law of identity come from? Is that material as well? Because if words are just mapping to or just material and it's all arbitrary, why wouldn't the law of identity be arbitrary at that point? You and I can label anything we'd like to communicate about anything we want, as long as we stick to the law of identity we communicate about. Why is the law of identity reliable and not arbitrary as well? And I'm gonna need a justification for where this law of identity is grounded and why it's constant. The only thing the laws of logic do is make sure that when we're communicating about apples, we communicate about apples and not apple like oranges. That's all they do. It's nomenclature for nomenclature, purely circular. An apple's an apple because that's what we call such fruits in English. No further justification needed. So if logic is not grounded anywhere metaphysical, if it's just grounded in material things, then it's also man-made and arbitrary. So he made the exact point that I was saying earlier. Well, a lot of logic, it's just material. It's just about sort of representing quote unquote truths about material things in the world. Then I said, that's also man-made and arbitrary. How do you know logic can be reliably used to support your claims about words having meaning? So then he says, as an atheist and an anti-realist and somewhat of a deconstructionist, all ideas are man-made. So everything is man-made. So then and ultimately arbitrary. So he admits that all ideas. So his argument is ultimately arbitrary. And so you forfeit the debate when you say your argument is arbitrary. And at best, for objectivity's sake, some concepts are hardwired into our biology. So now we're just telling a story. This is not a justification. Like what colors we see, it would be inconsistent of me to try and ground anything in kind of metaphysical I don't believe in. Well, here's the point of the transcendental argument. You do believe in metaphysical things, logic, the external world, self that you can't empirically verify, but you act inconsistently by saying that you don't believe in those things. And that's the whole point of the transcendental argument right there. So you utilize a whole host of things that you don't believe in. You have to borrow from the Christian worldview to make sense of the external world. It's quite clear, at least to me, that it's much harder to communicate effectively if you use vague or ambiguous words. Again, I thought all words were arbitrary, so where are we getting the terms vague and ambiguous from? And much easier to communicate effectively when we use well-defined words. Thus, communication to me seems much more reliable when I use the laws of logic. It's not perfect because there, at least to me, seems to be gray areas where our words or sentences aren't good enough to communicate effectively, like something is black. Right. So now he's trying to move well logic and words and stuff. It's kind of like observing and empirical observations where it's like tough to determine. And I'm saying that no, the things like the laws of logic, because you're acting as if they're certain, you're acting as if certain that words have meaning. These things need to be more certain than on the baseline of empirical observations. And so already you had a couple arguments, materialist atheists admitting that there's no logical power or force to believe in their arguments, or that their arguments are purely arbitrary. And in my opinion, you completely forfeit the debate when you say your arguments are arbitrary, because then I can just say God just is, and the argument's over. So that's a recap from some of the comments we had here. We're going to be doing, like I said, the first lecture will be on moral arguments. I have a whole thing prepared. Hopefully, maybe sometime this week or next week, we'll go over why I believe it's inescapable for the atheist, the moral problem. Then we're going to be going through all of the moral landscape. I've been reading it by Sam Harris, and we're going to talk about that. I'll have some book recommendations there. So thank you for watching the stream. I'll see you guys next time.